Apartheid, a concept of apartness, borrowed from the White Australia policy. According to Wikipedia, apartheid is an Afrikaans word for a system of racial segregation enforced through legislation by the National Party governments who were the ruling party of South Africa from 1948 to 1994. This legislation made white supremacy legal and enforceable, undermining all rights of the majority black inhabitants of South Africa. It is startling arrogance that allows a colonizer to take over another country to the extent that the original inhabitants are removed, negated, often forced into servitude and denied liberty in their own land. It is also reminiscent of Australia's history. The main difference being that because of Australian genocide and assimilation policies, the First Nations people were in the minority. This story is called SA Squared. It traces the similarities and key connections between the histories of South Africa and South Australia. It is an historical truth-telling account, a trip down memory lane, recounted by people, some of whom have since died, highlighting the actions taken by many, the dangers and roadblocks they faced. And it honours the efforts of many, including one particular family in Adelaide. Included in this film are images of posters collected by Irene Gale, which reflect the anti-apartheid work being done in both South Africa and South Australia. These were designed to help people understand the impact of apartheid. Adelaide and Cape Town are on the same latitudinal parallel. Interestingly, the governments of white South Africa and white Australia were considered close allies and sister countries during the apartheid era. Similarly, both countries were deeply polarised. Through activism, though, lifelong friendships were made along this line of latitudinal parallel, such as that of Irene Gale, an anti-apartheid campaigner in South Australia, and Phyllis Naidoo, an anti-apartheid activist in South Africa. Over the decades, they corresponded first as pen pals, then emails, and finally in person. Irene recalls a conversation with Phyllis.
And she commented when we were there in 2009, she said, "You told us things that we didn't know were happening in South Africa." She said, "I remember you rang me up one time and you said, 'What's happening up, And she said, "What event?" And you said, "Where all the people have been murdered at the funeral." And she said, "We didn't know that it had happened until you told us you'd heard it on your news, and we never ever heard it on our news. And so you were able to keep us in touch with what was happening in our own country."
The late 60s and early 70s were revolutionary in so many ways, including increased attention to black literature, liberation, and open communication across national borders. The war in Vietnam gave rise to a strong but mainly peaceful anti-war movement, and people were shocked by the state's reaction to it. It became a forerunner in increased violence against peaceful protesters. In Aboriginal activist Gary Foley's words, "It demonstrated the racist imperialist system we were up against." So, the all-white Springbok rugby tour in 1971 was always going to be controversial and difficult. On the one hand, trade unions were actively denouncing apartheid, and on the other, the state and police were asserting their power. The ACTU urged union officials to take whatever actions necessary as an act of conscience to obstruct the tour, while the police, expecting trouble, had clearly been instructed to use whatever force was necessary to keep protesters off the field and make sure the game went on. Irene recalls the impact Adelaide made on the Springboks.
When the Springboks arrived in Adelaide, they'd been flown from Perth in small private planes since Qantas wouldn't carry them due to a union ban. There was a huge crowd waiting at the airport, so they were landed on the grass at the far side of the airport and were taken by taxis to a motel. A student on a motorbike followed them and notified us all where they were. Some of us were at the motel before the last taxis arrived, and I'll never forget the frightened faces in one taxi as Zimbabwean activist Sekai Holland, dressed in stunning national costume, opened their door and said, "Futsak, Springbok, scram or get away," as said to a dog. People stayed there chanting and throwing stones on the roof all night during their stay, and one Springbok later wrote the story of their tour, saying that their stay in Adelaide was the most horrible of the tour.
It was all out on both sides. At that time, South Australia promoted itself as a progressive, fair-minded state, genteel even. Adelaide, the city of churches, the non-convict state, the letters patent state, the peaceably settled, the first to give women the vote state, mostly a veneer, as it has always had an underbelly. Long-time Aboriginal activist Professor Gary Foley recalls the contradictions.
Reality often collides with people's perceptions of things, but the reality that I saw with my own eyes told me what the real story of the underbelly of South Australia was all about.
In a previous conversation, you mentioned this word. Adelaide is perceived as genteel. It's sort of like it's more English than the rest of the country.
And yet that genteel society produces some of the more of extraordinary Australian serial killers. At the time we're talking about in early 1970s, there seemed to be a lot of gay men that seemed to have been murdered around the place there. So, there's always been evidence of the Adelaide underbelly there for anyone who cared to take any notice. But Australians have a long history of self-delusion, encouraged along the way in more recent times by a man who started off in Adelaide, Rupert Murdoch, and his tabloids and his Sky TV.
For the Gale family and thousands of others, it showed the extent to which governments would go to maintain the status quo. Irene recalls the experience of two of her children.
Roger and Jenny, our two eldest, had been to organised student meetings at Adelaide Uni, and the plan was to jump over the fence to disrupt the game. When it came to Jenny's turn, a bystander pulled her back. She angrily asked, "Why did you do that?" "Look at that poor bastard. Do you want to end up like that?" She looked and saw Roger being belted up by the police.
In Australia, anti-apartheid groups formed all over the country. Irene recalls the pivotal role Neville Curtis played.
The National Union of South African Students leader was Neville Curtis, who somehow was smuggled to Australia and was allowed to settle here by the Whitlam government in 1972 as one of the first political refugees. His sister and her 5-year-old daughter lived in Luanda and were killed by a parcel bomb. Her little boy saw it happen. Neville and Helen Hill, a fellow activist in Canberra, set up Care National in 1973, meaning Campaign Against Racial Exploitation. Say Car had changed their name to Say Care so that it became the same as the new national body, and we became the South Australian representative body of Care National.
For some years, the national office ran from the Adelaide branch. The anti-apartheid movement highlighted the racism in Australia's own backyard. Professor Gary Foley says people's eyes were opening to the similarities.
At the time, in the late 60s, early 70s, in Australia and indeed internationally, there was a convergence of a whole range of issues that were firing people up. I mean, the global issue of the day to do with race and history had to do with the apartheid system in South Africa, and that had ripples all around the world, all the way to genteel Adelaide. You know, there was the Vietnam War and the growing and massive, in the end, anti-war movement that developed, and that was primarily, in part, fueled along by the so-called revolt of the youth of the world, you know, in 1968 in Paris, and all of these things. It also was coinciding with the arse end of decolonisation in Africa, Asia and the Pacific, you know, and so there was a convergence of so many issues both locally and globally that by the time the Springboks came to Australia, it was inevitable that, you know, there was going to be fireworks. Although, having said that, I should say that to us Aboriginal activists in Redfern at the time, who'd sort of grown in numbers since in the post-1967 referendum period, in the first years after that's when the Black Power movement emerged in Redfern, and we felt you know, when we were young and crazy, 17, 18 years old, we felt that we were fighting on issues of white Australian racism, which we saw as, you know, one of the primary obstacles in the path of our struggle for justice. And so it was with some surprise in 1970 or so, when what seemed to us in Redfern to be the sudden appearance of all of these white Australian anti-racists, you know, who suddenly this anti-apartheid movement was there. And we were somewhat perplexed by this, and it was as a result of us being perplexed that Paul Coe, one of the leaders of the Redfern Black Power movement, at a lead-up rally to the Springboks coming out to Australia, at a lead-up anti-apartheid rally, Paul Coe commandeered the microphone and challenged the white Australian anti-racists. He said to them, how come you're coming out in your thousands on an issue of white racism halfway around the world? Don't you really need to look in the mirror, go home and look in the mirror and ask yourself what's going on under your noses in your own country, you know? And co-challenged the anti-apartheid activists to start attending the big land rights marches that we were organising in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane and Adelaide at the time, and challenged them to turn up to those marches as well so that they shouldn't be perceived as hypocrites.
As the anti-racism movement grew, so did the extreme neo-Nazi white supremacy groups like National Action. Sybil Wakefield remembers the growing concern about this group.
We used to be holding up posters and stuff, and they walk right through and break our posters. That's what they used to do, you know. They sprayed our cars. Jenny Burford, they slashed all 4 tyres of her car because we used to have the Aboriginal sticker, the map of Australia with the red. But I know they sprayed all our windows. We had so much trouble with them. We actually had to give evidence before Irene Moss. Yeah, well, she met with all of us and we gave evidence. We all went to that big hearing. I think it was at the town hall or somewhere. Michael Brandon, he spoke.
Jenny Burford says you had to take their death threats seriously.
They're actually to be feared because it was at the same time as the South African Defence Force, I think, was seen to have ties with some of these groups. And we had National Action in Adelaide being pretty confrontational, but I know in Western Australia there were fires, they fire bombings and stuff like that. And the South African Defence Force seemed to be lurking in the background because, of course, at this time apartheid was still a real thing, and certainly I think the South African government didn't want these movements growing, and they were very happy to foment right-wing groups in Australia.
The principles of apartheid are not unique to South Africa, Australia or anywhere else. For them to work, they rely on some basic tenets. For Jeremy Hurley, growing up in South Africa, having black servants was normal, as was segregation.
White people generally were always racist, but I think everyone who's born in a country like that is racist. You just grow up racist unless you know people who are different from you. And I think you just grow up racist because the way people are presented to you is that they're dangerous and they're different and they're not of your kind. It was always racist like that, But in a country like South Africa gave people the imprimatur to be as racist as they wanted to be as well. Servants would also have to call me boss, as when I was 5, a little kid, I was boss. And not only the servants, but any black people, like in the street and stuff, would call you boss. It really warps your view of yourself and your place in the world.
Sybil Wakefield laughingly points out the absurdity of it all.
All the schools, there were schools that were affiliated to churches, but they weren't that private. We all had to do the same coloured curriculum if it was a coloured school. The blacks, of course, had their curriculum and so forth. And the Indians had theirs. Indian people also went to different schools. They did an excellent job of dividing and ruling, dividing the whole country into little blocks, because the whole of South Africa was divided up into these areas where coloured people lived, where the blacks lived, where the whites lived, where the Indians lived, etc. It was just that the whites were right at the top of the pecking order. But, the Chinese were Asian and the Japanese were white, registered as white. Yeah, because they had more money. It was a lot to do with money, but they also were white. Japanese were whiter looking than some Chinese were darker. And this is another thing.
So it was about skin colour.
Definitely. Yeah. It was definitely about skin colour.
Susan Tilley talks about the parallels.
So having come to Australia from South Africa, which is a country built on and by apartheid capitalism, or also called racial capitalism, where the really insidious and I'd say violent insertion of racism and segregation was used to divide and rule and to extract and exploit people's labour, it's really clear that the parallels and continuities in Australia and in South Australia are just as stark and as vicious, albeit sometimes more hidden. I'd say the parallels and the effects across both countries of colonisation, invasion, dispossession, stolen land, stolen minerals and resources, and stolen generations, culture and language have been played out through economic and class interests and privilege, and the myriad ways in which these intersect with race. Having lived in both countries has, I guess, enabled me to see and compare the dark histories of both places and to more clearly understand how exploitation and the instruments of racism are used globally to advance the interests of capitalist and market-driven economies. And this throws into stark relief the similarities between the functional relationship between South Africa's economy and its apartheid architecture, and in parallel, Australia's economy and its still unsettled and stubbornly unacknowledged and persisting history of dispossession, political exclusion, and socio-economic repression.
Christianity played a part in justifying racism. The doctrine of discovery, written by a Spanish pope, enabled and empowered the colonizing mentality. In the Bible, Joshua 9:21 talks about particular races being hewers of wood and water carriers, another way to describe servants, who were fit only to perform menial tasks. Othering with God's blessing. However, key liberation theologists and the South African Council of Churches played a pivotal role in countering apartheid. Many died while in police detention, as highlighted in a poem by Chris Van Wyck.
He fell from the 9th floor. He hanged himself. He slipped on a piece of soap while washing. He hanged himself. He slipped on a piece of soap while washing. He fell from the 9th floor. He hanged himself while washing. He slipped from the 9th floor. He hung from the 9th floor. He slipped on the 9th floor while washing. He fell from a piece of soap while slipping. He hung from the 9th floor. He washed from the 9th floor while slipping. He hung from a piece of soap while washing.
Over 1,600 people were banned and thousands of people died under the brutal apartheid rule. Irene reflects on the In Memoriam campaign in 1982, which highlighted some of the people who were killed by the police.
Hundreds of people paid $5 to insert a notice in the paper on the 16th of June. The advertiser at first refused to print them, quote, because those killed were not in South Australia. But when I waved the hundreds of $5 notes in front of them, they couldn't resist and finally agreed to print them. The result was a most impressive collection of notices in the advertiser. We repeated this again a few years later. The wording of the notices was based on the official South African reports, word for word.
Under the then Prime Minister, P.W. Botha's rule, foreign allies were warned to mind their own business. Irene remembers when her husband Jim attended a particular conference in September 1985.
Well, it was a conference of about 30 specialists from around the world on the subject of Namibia, planning the UN's next year's actions together. Namibia came under the same apartheid system as South Africa did.
So you described that he was feeling unwell on the plane home and how he got progressively worse over the next couple of days?
Yes, he still went to work, but he complained of feeling ill and he couldn't sleep.
And on the third day home?
Andrew from the college where Jim taught came to my place and after a struggle getting the words out told me that Jim had died.
Oh, Irene, what was the first thought that you had when you heard that?
I thought the bastards have somehow got him.
Sometimes later, the Reverend Frank Shikane, was found to have had his underpants laced with a toxic nerve agent in an attempt to kill him. The people responsible were found guilty of attempted murder, but given suspended sentences. Reverend Shikane experienced similar symptoms to those Jim Gale suffered before he died of an apparent heart attack. These examples reflect the gravity of the widespread resistance which resulted in these guiding documents from both countries. The South African Freedom Charter and the Uluru Statement from the Heart were both written by and for the oppressed people of each country. The Freedom Charter was drafted during a mass meeting in 1955 called the Congress of the People, asserting that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of all the people. Similarly, the Uluru Statement from the Heart was drafted in 2017 by delegates at a National First Nations Constitutional Convention at Uluru to draft and endorse the statement, which was then issued to the Australian people, calling for a constitutionally entrenched First Nations voice to Parliament and a Makarrata Commission to oversee a process of treaty making and truth-telling. In the early 90s, apartheid in South Africa was coming to an end, leading to the formation of a democratic government in 1994. Around the same time, in Australia, it was finally recognised that there were people living, thriving, trading, navigating on the land and waters before the colonial settlers arrived. That lie of an empty land, known as terra nullius, was only acknowledged with the Mabo Judgment of 1992, and after nearly 200 years, First Nations people were recognised as being just that.